You've got to feel sorry for BMW, really. And no, I'm not taking pity on them after their recent PR disaster on social media. I'm talking about when they tried to replace the Mini. The car which many would argue was irreplaceable, and certainly in literal and regulatory terms, in the late 1990s, it was. By that point, you couldn't make a car that was that small, had that little in the way of safety equipment, i.e. basically none, and was powered by the inefficient and fairly un-eco-friendly A-Series engine. In short, whatever was due to wear the new Mini badge was always going to be a bit different. But no one could have imagined quite how different. In 1997, at the Frankfurt Motor Show, the first concept was revealed, with the BMW and Rover collaboration creating the concept for the new Mini, and being powered by, and at the same time revealing, the new Rover and Chrysler collaboration Tritec engine. After BMW sold Rover in 2000 though, it retained the Mini project for itself and moved the intended production plant from Longbridge to the Cowley plant in Oxford. In 2001, we finally got a production version of the new Mini, and it did indeed use that Chrysler Tritec engine that had been previewed back in '97. But in reality, the engine could have been just about anything for what the public cared. What they cared about was how it looked, and how it looked was similar and yet very different. Yeah, I know, it's bigger than the original Mini, we've heard that one before. But it had to be. A new car needs all kinds of things like bigger bumpers, crumple zones, airbags, and all kinds of crash protection that meant it simply couldn't be as small or as light as the car that it was indirectly replacing. But look closer and you'll see a lot of styling cues on the R50 that are inspired by its predecessor. The big grille that looks like a moustache, these big headlights, and the fact the whole front of the car looks like a face. Not to mention that for a new car, there's an awful lot of chrome on the new Mini. Imagine a classic Mini in a modern guise where it has to be bigger, it has to have all that safety kit, but it still has that same classic face, and you end up with this. Inside too, it's a great blend of old and new. Yes, you get this big central speedo like you got in a classic Mini, and a generous helping of chrome throughout, but you get modern conveniences, airbags, power steering, electric windows, a CD player, all these things that make your day-to-day experience that much nicer in a more modern car. In short, this is a great example of a classic Mini, but made a little bit more livable. The next thing you need to do then in replacing the classic Mini is to make it drive well, and oh did they. Even in relatively low-powered Cooper form like we've got here, the R50 is a gem to chuck around. The steering is beautifully weighted, it's sharp and responsive, it's got an eager turn in, the suspension is really planted, and it grips so well. It takes quite a lot to outfox an R50 on a twisty road, and it's good fun as well. So the R50 then really was the complete package. It had the looks, it drove fantastically well, but because it had modern equipment, modern emissions gear and modern safety equipment, it could last in production with ease. But it did make you pay for that. Even the base Mini 1, the lowest spec with the least equipment and the least powerful engine, was a £10,000 car, which made it thousands more expensive than any of its Super Mini rivals. But that didn't put people off. They were still willing to wait months, sometimes years, and pay thousands over the list price to get their hands on the very first R50 Minis. Opinions remain divided though. Purists scoffed at the R50, they jokingly called it the Maxi and said it was too big, too heavy and too complex to ever be considered a Mini. But let's be real here. BMW couldn't give the new Mini an A-Series because it was far too small, too unkind to the environment and nowhere near powerful enough to haul around the bigger, heavier car that the Mini had to become in order to integrate all the safety gear that it needed to have by that point. It was never going to be a direct replacement to the original Mini. BMW were doing the best with what they were allowed to do, and in that respect, they took on the unachievable and they achieved it. Despite how much bigger the R50 is than the classic Mini, there is one area where it certainly isn't a big car, and that's the boot. That is not a big boot by anyone's standards, particularly when you factor in how much this car's grown over the classic Mini that it replaces. Mini did have a plan though, the same but slightly different. much like the conditions under which we filmed it. So as much as I've tried to match the hair and the clothes as much as I can, please do ignore the change in scenery, in time of day, in weather, and various other things that you are about to see. And after that seamless transition, we're now onto a Mini that actually has some cargo space. Welcome to the R55, or as it's more commonly known to you and me, the Clubman. Now, if you've watched this channel before, you'll know that the Clubman was originally the name for the 1969 facelift for the classic Mini. But by 2007, the Clubman had become its own variant of the Mini. This is actually based on the facelifted R56 generation of the new Mini, brought along in 2006. This was brought out a year later, and it's far more practical. If you couldn't tell, the rear end's a bit different. The Clubman did away with the hatchback boot lid like we saw on the normal R50 Mini, and instead we got what they called barn doors. Why are they called that, you ask? Well, they literally are barn doors. The whole back half of the car opens up to reveal over 100 litres extra capacity in the Clubman, up to 260 litres. That's a lot of water. In more real world terms though, it means you can actually get a decent load of shopping in the back of a Clubman. The other thing the Clubman did better was rear seat access. This front door opens as normal. You can get into the front the same as you can in any other R50 Mini. But you've got a little handle down here, pull that, and you've got a rear hinged suicide door to get into the back seat, and this genuinely offers easier access into the back than any R50 Mini before it. You might have noticed something a bit interesting about this rear hinged door though. If you live in a left-hand drive country like Germany or Italy for example, this door is going to open onto the curb, and that means you're probably going to have kids in the back. They can get out of here and onto the pavement. However, unlike Hyundai did with their 3-door Veloster a few years later, Mini didn't switch this door around to the other side for right-hand drive cars, and that means in the UK for example, this door is going to open into the road. Good thinking there, Mini. Despite all that extra space though, the Clubman only actually weighs 75 kilos more than the standard Mini hatchback. It's still a compact, lightweight car. It's still sharp, it's still responsive, it's still the same things that we came to love about the R50 Mini when it was launched. But now, you can put your stuff in it as well. And if the Clubman wasn't practical enough for you, in 2013, the Mini van came back with the Club Van. As a van, it didn't really make sense. It cost more than a Citroën Berlingo or a Ford Transit Connect. It didn't have anything like the payload capacity, and whilst it did drive well, most tradespeople don't need that in a van. In short, the Club Van is a very interesting variant, but probably best forgotten. But the Clubman itself most definitely isn't. It only cost you 1,200 quid more when it was new than the equivalent Mini hatch. And for that you got a car that was way more practical, that was still just as much fun to chuck around, and it was something a little bit different. But that said, an estate car isn't what people get excited about. There is still something to be said for the original R50. So you join me back in the R50 hatch to consider, as this car hits its 20th birthday this year, can we really consider the new Mini a classic? Well, I think so. Think about what this car represents 20 years on. It's a cheap second-hand car, it's easy to work on yourself, it's a common first car for 17-year-olds, it's commonly modified, it's used in motorsport, and it's recognised as a great way to have a hoot down a B road. In short, exactly the same qualities that we recognise of the classic Mini after the same 2 decades. By that logic then, not only is the R50 a classic, but it is most definitely, no matter what the purists say, the new Mini.